Hi, my name is Sally Rogers. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation and a longtime researcher in the field. Welcome. I'm going to talk a little bit about measurement. Measurement is a topic that a lot of people find boring, but what I say to researchers all the time, especially early investigators, is if you don't have a good measure, you probably can't mount a good study. So measurement is really critical, and that's why I thought it was important to introduce you to some basic concepts about measurement in our field. I did mention in another video that quantitative studies always involve measurement of some kind, and that is a truism. And so knowing different kinds of measurement and how we can rely on them or not is really what I wanted to focus on in this presentation. So without good measurement, our studies are really invalid, they're meaningless. I have worked with some programs over the years. They might call me and ask for some advice. They might tell me that they're developing a new measure to measure empowerment, let's say, and I say, well, have you looked in the research that exists to see if there's a good measure out there that's been proven to work? No, they wanted to develop their own measure, but honestly, what I have to say is we have no clue whether that's a good measure of empowerment, and I'll tell you a little bit more about why that's the case. Why is measurement important? Well, we have to measure kind of two broad categories of things when we're doing research. We have what we call our dependent variables, or those are the outcomes that we want to achieve. So let's just say that we're doing an intervention to improve job performance. We have to have a way of measuring vocational or job outcomes. But we also have what we call independent factors that might predict those outcomes. Those might be things like self-esteem or gender or age, and we have to make sure that we measure them accurately as well. So what makes for a good measure? You could probably go on and on about this for a long time, but I'll try to keep it really brief. Here are some factors to consider. When anybody tells you they're measuring something with this particular instrument or that measure, you have to ask these questions. Is it a reliable measure? Is it a valid measure? Is it sensitive? And is it not too burdensome? What do we mean by a reliable measure? A reliable measure means that if you were to measure that factor, that dependent variable, independent variable, whatever it is, over and over again, you get the same result. I always like to use the example of the bathroom scale because it resonates with me. So in the olden days when we had a scale that you get on and it was kind of an analog scale, I could get on that scale multiple times and it would give me multiple different weights. I could get on, get off, and it would give me a different weight, and I choose the lowest one. So now I have a digital scale. It gives me the same number over and over again. That's a reliable measure. So whether you're measuring self-esteem or empowerment, if you get the same picture over and over again, if you were to measure over and over again, that is a reliable measure. It doesn't speak to the fact that it might not measure what you really want, but at least it gives you the same picture over and over again. Reliability is considered the absolute basic minimum without which you cannot have a measure. It's critical. It's useless to have a measure that's not reliable, even if it looks good in other ways. So there are different kinds of reliability. One is called test-retest. I test you on day 1, I test you again on day 10. You look the same, you have a reliable measure. I want to observe something in a person, how confident that person appears. I have Joe and Susan look at that person, do a rating. If they agree in their rating, they've seen the same things, they have inter-rater reliability. So those are the two most common kinds of reliability we have, but you should just know that reliability needs to be established and reported on in any research study so that you know you have a good measure on your hands. Now I'm going to talk to you about what it means to have a valid measure. So we have a reliable measure, it gives us the same picture over and over again, but is it valid? So if I said to you, I'm going to use a yardstick to see how high your self-esteem is, you'd say ridiculous, invalid, doesn't make any sense. Of course not. We need something that measures what it says it's going to measure. And how do we determine that? Well, there are different ways of determining that. We can ask experts. How do you define this thing we call empowerment, let's just say? We can look at other measures if they're available and see if those other measures are similar to ours. So there are multiple ways to establish if a scale is valid, And those are things that you should look for in any reporting of a research study, whether validity studies show that that measure holds up and measures what it says it's going to measure. So taken together, we also want measures that are relatively easy for a respondent to relate to and to complete. Many times when we're developing a measure, we ask ourselves the question, can the people that are going to use this scale, can they relate to these items, these words, these ideas that we're proposing? If they can't, it's not going to be a good measure. The other thing is the amount of burden. If it takes hours and hours to do an assessment, that's not good because people will not stick with you for that whole time. So short but valid and reliable is really important. But good measurement is really critical, and I would even go so far as to say that I wouldn't embark on a research study if I didn't have good measures to start with. No research design or intervention is going to overcome the problem of poor measurement. The other thing that you want to keep in mind is whether a measure is sensitive to change. So sometimes we have more blunt measurements that are really not tuned into the nuances and the ways in which people can change, and that becomes a problem. So let me just give you some ideas of things that we've thought have been important in terms of measurement. This is an example of some of the domains that we focus on. Things like residential outcomes, vocational, educational, social, quality of life, satisfaction with services, level of functioning, empowerment, recovery, symptoms, physical well-being and health, substance abuse, etc. But it's not good enough to just specify the domain of interest to say, oh, I'm interested in vocational outcomes or I'm interested in residential outcomes. You really have to take it a step further and do what we call in research operationalize or define in detail how you intend to measure something. So if you say, for example, you want to measure symptoms or self-esteem, you really need to say, well, what do I mean by that? Self-esteem means different things to different people. And so you really have to get down and dirty and define that concept so that you can measure it well. Here's just an example of when people say, well, I want to study residential outcomes. Well, what do we mean by residential outcomes? There are many. There are things like residential stability or disruptions, residential independence. Can the person function on their own in their own apartment? How integrated are they in their community? How long can they stay in one place, their residential tenure? Does their residential tenure get interrupted by hospitalizations? And are they satisfied with where they live? So these are all important domains of residential functioning. So you can't just specify the domain, you have to get more specific and talk about these operational terms in residential, in the residential domain. Here's another example. When I say I want to study vocational outcomes, there are many different ways I could define that. I could talk about the level of employment that a person has, whether they're working competitively or in some kind of sheltered situation. I could talk about the job level, something they call job prestige, which isn't such a nice term, actually, but that has to do with whether it's a professional job, a skilled job, an unskilled job, a technical job. I could look at whether people need supports on the job in order to function. I could look at their continuity of employment. Are they able to maintain a job for a long period of time? And I could also look at their job satisfaction. So those are the things that I wanted to convey to you about measurement. First, measurement is absolutely critical for any research study of almost any kind. That we need reliable, valid, sensitive measures that are not too burdensome for the participant to complete, and that we need to think in very operational and specific terms about what it is we want to measure. Thank you very much. I hope you found this video on measurement helpful to you. Thanks.